La séance, bienvenue.
I call this meeting to order. Welcome everyone to this 15th meeting of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Pursuant to Standing Order 108-2 and the motion adopted by the Subcommittee on Monday, January 26th, 2026, the Subcommittee is meeting to continue its study of the current situation for human rights defenders and democracy defenders around the world. Today's meeting is happening in hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members can participate in person or via Zoom.
I'd like to make a few comments for the benefits of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. For those on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. J'aimerais maintenant souhaiter la bienvenue.
I would now like to welcome our witnesses.
As individual, Madame Gabriela Bardal, Assistant Professor of Political Science and the Chairholder of Canada Research Chair in Women, Democracy, and Power in the Francophonie Université Sainte-Anne. Madame Leslie Campbell, Analyst and Consultant, International Democracy Assistant. She is with us by video conference. Professor Miriam Cohen, Associated Professor and Chairholder of Canada Research Chair in Human Rights and International Reparative Justice. Monsieur Kevin DeVaux, lawyer by video conference. Madame Monica Leroy, Fellow, Montreal Institute for Global Security. From United Transitional Cabinet of Belarus, Honorable Sviatlana Tikhonovskaya, Head and President-elect of Belarus, by video conference. Bienvenue à vous tous et tous et...
Welcome to all of you. Each witness will be given 5 minutes for introductory remarks. We will begin with Gabriela Bardal.
Monsieur le Président, honorables membres.
Mr. Chair, honorable members, thank you for the invitation. My name is Gabrielle Bardal. I'm the Canada Research Chair on Women, Democracy and Power in the Francophonie at Université Sainte-Anne. I have more than 20 years of experience in democracy assistance across more than 60 countries, including with the UN, international civil society organizations, and Global Affairs Canada. My central message is this: supporting resilient democracy internationally through Canada's foreign policy tools is urgent, but it requires a shift from technical support to protecting people, power, and participation. Canada is uniquely positioned to lead that shift by setting the normative agenda, establishing a special representative, and mobilizing Canadian expertise. Today, we are living through a rupture in the international order. The rules-based system that once provided predictability is under strain, and in this context, democracy is not only a values issue, it's where Canada's values and interests converge. This is the essence of our strategic interest. Canada has a strong ability to respond. We have a respected track record in supporting democratic institutions, but to remain effective, we must update how we understand democratic threats and how we respond to them. The nature of democratic erosion has changed. We're no longer seeing only the dismantling of institutions, but the manipulation of institutions and the shrinking of participation, including in untraditional ways, such as through violence against women in politics. At the same time, indicators of democratic decline are appearing. Attacks on women's rights organizations are among the clearest early warning signs. The strategies used to undermine democracy have also become more sophisticated. We're seeing hybrid approaches that combine restrictive legislation, digital manipulation, and narrative warfare. Gendered disinformation and identity-based attacks are increasingly used to polarize societies and weaken democratic cohesion. Taken together, the central challenge to democracy today is not only the weakening of institutions, it's the systematic shrinking and distortion of democratic space. Canada's work in supporting parliaments, electoral systems, and governance remains essential but is no longer sufficient. Canada must build on these strengths by pairing institutional support with approaches that protect participation, respond to hybrid threats, and engage with power dynamics. This includes recognizing that democratic contestation now takes place in information spaces and public narratives, and that trust-based, long-term partnerships with civil society are critical to sustaining democratic resilience. Canada also has a comparative advantage in how it works. Some of Canada's most effective leadership has been demonstrated through our engagement on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which emphasizes relationships, networks, and sustained engagement across government, civil society, and international partners. This model prioritizes trust, convening power, and political insight, allowing Canada to operate with flexibility in complex environments. To operationalize this shift, Canada should take two key steps. First, it should ground its approach in a clear normative framework for democracy, drawing on international commitments and Canadian constitutional principles, and consider developing a more integrated national action framework. Second, Canada should establish an Office of a Special Representative for Democracy to facilitate coherent cross-government responses, provide visible leadership, convene partners, align Canada's tools, and enable rapid responses to emerging threats. Finally, this should be embedded within a broader network of Canadian expertise, ensuring real-time insight, adaptive policy, and rapid response through a model inspired by the WPSN Canada or other options suggested by colleagues. Finally, this work should be grounded in multi-partisan commitment and gender-based analysis, or GBA+. Democracy is not a partisan issue, it's a foundational Canadian value. Likewise, GBA plus analysis enhances our collective national security and economic interests. In conclusion, to defend resilient democracy today, we need to move beyond technical fixes and engage directly with the realities of power. Who holds power? How is it contested? And who is excluded? Canada has the experience, credibility, and tools it needs to lead. What is needed now is the strategic focus and institutional anchor to act on that leadership. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Bardal. Ton est très bien respecté.
Thank you. You respected the 5-minute limit very well. I hope the others will too. Now I would ask Leslie Campbell to take the floor for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, and good afternoon, Mr. Chair, a member of the subcommittee. Thanks very much for inviting us all to participate today. I'm going to give a little history here, but come around to very much a similar point to Gabrielle. Created Department of Government Efficiency in the United States, or DOGE, ordered officials at the State Department and USAID to immediately suspend. Well, a true review never took place. Several weeks later, a termination list was circulated, which canceled.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président. Pardon, Monsieur le Président.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Point of order. I think that we're having a connectivity problem, and that could affect the health and safety of our interpreters. Could you please tell us how to proceed? Yes, we'll deal with that right away.
We would like to continue with you, Mr. Leslie, and if the problem insists, we'll come back to you. You don't lose any minute. Okay, please go ahead.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Sorry, you could start
review-
from the top. You could start
Okay.
from the top. Okay.
All right. Thanks very much. In late January 2025, the newly created Department of Governmental Efficiency, or DOGE, ordered officials at the State Department and the U.S. Agency for National Development to suspend review. Well, a true review never took place. Several weeks later, a termination list was circulated, which canceled.
Sorry, Mr. Leslie, I'm sorry to cut you here. We would like to come back to you. We'll try to arrange this situation.
All right.
We go. Cohen to take the floor for 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Président,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Miriam Cohen. I hold the research chair for Canada on international restorative justice at the University of Montreal. I want to sincerely thank you for inviting me and for the attention you've given to this situation of democracy and human rights defenders around the world. It's an honor to be able to contribute to your work on a subject that directly concerns the rule of law, democratic governance, and the protection of fundamental freedoms. My remarks today will focus on 3 things. First, a brief overview of the current situation for human rights defenders worldwide. Then, the institutional protection mechanisms. And finally, some best practices and recommendations. Human rights defenders play a key role in protecting and respecting human rights and maintaining democratic principles. They come from diverse backgrounds: young adults, members of indigenous communities, recognized professionals, members of civil society. They work in sometimes isolated, remote and rural settings, in places of detention, in conflict, in crisis zones, and alongside refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers. They're also intervening in new spheres, notably climate change, artificial intelligence, and others related to new technologies. Despite their essential role, human rights defenders are regularly targeted by intimidation, threats, assaults, kidnappings, false accusations, and serious rights violations by state and non-state actors. They're also subjected to unfair trials, unjustified convictions, and they are sometimes forced into hiding. This is part of a larger context of democratic backsliding. Global indicators show a continuous deterioration of political and civil liberties over the past more than a decade. When democratic institutions weaken, human rights defenders often become targets, specifically because they represent a countervailing power. Legally speaking, various mechanisms currently contribute to the protection of human rights defenders who are exercising their activities. At the global level, the UN General Assembly adopted in 1999 the Declaration on the Rights and Responsibilities of Individuals, Groups, and Organs of Society to promote and protect universally recognized human rights. Now, this instrument is not legally binding under international law, but the declaration refers to the UN Charter, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and others. These protections are also regularly discussed by the Human Rights Council during universal periodic reviews. The Special Rapporteur on the Situation of Human Rights Defenders, established in 2000, plays a key role in documenting this work and also formulates recommendations. Regionally, a number of initiatives complement these frameworks. In Europe, the European Council adopted a protocol to improve the protection of their rights. In Africa, the African Commission created a mandate for a special rapporteur with a particular focus on certain vulnerable categories, notably women, and environmental defenders. It's also important to remember that states can only delegate ensure these protections under certain conditions. Human rights defenders are essential to the functioning of democratic societies. Their work helps prevent abuse, strengthen public trust, and support the rule of law. Their protection is thus a democratic imperative. In this context, there are three particularly important priorities internationally. First, fighting the impunity for those who commit violence against human rights defenders. Secondly, ensuring freedom of association and access to funding for civil society. And third, having clear and consistent political support for threatened defenders. Thank you for your attention.
Exactement.
Thank you, Ms. Cohen. You were also exactly right under the 5-minute mark. Thank you very much. Now, I will ask Kevin DeVoe to speak for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you to the committee for this opportunity to present. Just briefly, my background. I'm a lawyer based in Halifax, 35 years. I was elected 4 times to the Nova Scotia House of Assembly. 20 years ago, I left politics and started working internationally, first with the United Nations and more recently as a consultant, focused on political governance, particularly support to parliaments and political parties. I've had the pleasure of working directly with more than 80 parliaments around the world. My focus today is probably more broadly to talk about Canada's role in building systems that can ensure democratic resilience and support the democratic advocates around the world. In particular, I think we can all agree that in the last year or so, the world order has shifted. It's no longer good enough for Canada to follow others, but it's time for us to lead. I would hope that the speech from January in Davos by the Prime Minister was a starting point for that. But if it's going to be more than words on a page, then we really do need concrete ideas about how Canada is going to build those coalition of middle powers. And it's no longer about us being in the backseat. It's about finding our added value and being prepared to lead in securing democratic states and values. So I understand the Canadian foreign policy has shifted away from perhaps other priorities to now focusing on Canada's security and building stable trading partnerships for our economic prosperity. I don't disagree with that pivot. But I would say that we don't have security as a country. We don't have stable trading and economic prosperity without partners who are following democratic standards. For example, the rule of law. Without an independent, robust judiciary, the enforcement of trade agreements and supply chain contracts isn't going to happen. Without robust civil society and free media, holding the government to account becomes much more challenging. So we need to ensure that those democratic standards and values and countries based on those are the basis of our partnerships. So if we're talking about a new world order, I would also argue it's time for a new approach. The old way of overseas development assistance, ODA, and project-based modalities where the global north imposed its needs on the global south will no longer be viable. Canada needs to lead not through prescriptive requirements that it imposes through project cycles, but through collaboration amongst like-minded democratic countries and nascent movements in more autocratic settings, as I think we will hear from our fellow presenter from Belarus. Canada does have unique value, whether that's our 2 languages, our 2 legal systems, our cadre of experts in many fields of democratic governance, our history of gender-based analysis as a priority. These are things that I think allow Canada to provide and have the gravitas to lead. And we want to facilitate dialogue and solutions between the North and South. Again, this isn't about imposing from the North to the South, but how we begin to talk to each other as equals. So let's not create a new institution that will be looking to solve problems that may or may not exist, but let's invest in bespoke and tailor-made analysis and use Canada's convening power to create solutions where democracy is challenged or threatened. I have one very concrete recommendation with regard to that. I think the government of Canada needs to invest in a rapid deployment system of democratic governance and security experts that can provide timely, high-quality political analysis that can inform the government as it makes decisions with regard to global events. I suspect that, in fact, I'm pretty confident that that's lacking at the moment. So such a system should be based on, it should be external from the government so we can have more frank advice and analysis. It should be based on a roster of Canadian experts from which a small group can be drawn, and they can conduct political and security analysis in hotspots. Think of Bangladesh after the 2024 uprising, or think of Lebanon perhaps in a month or two, if possible, when this conflict ends. It's able to draw upon Canadian academic and think tanks for background and analytical research. It's able to provide Global Affairs Canada and the broader government with concrete political analysis and recommendations within weeks of a global crisis to inform our actions and our policies. And it would give Canada a seat at the table through our rapid evidence-based analysis that can be shared with potential partners. Canada's offering to its partners is a commitment to facilitate and create space for an informed dialogue that can create solutions and support tailored interventions to a given country or region in a given circumstance. By building a rapid deployment system for political analysis, Canada is building a reputation as a broker and an incubator of bespoke solutions for a given country or region in crisis. This is soft power, and soft power is the type of political capital Canada needs as we seek new trading and security partners. And finally, I will just say that some of the other recommendations I've heard already, particularly from Madame Bardal, around a special representative or an office of democracy, I think fit very well within this rapid deployment as ways of enhancing Canada's capacity to
Excuse me, time is almost 20 seconds up. If you could wrap it up quickly, please. Thank you.
I'm actually done, Honorable Chairperson. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry. So we go back to him. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And now I would like to invite Honorable Sviatlana Chiknowskaya to take the floor for 5 minutes. Welcome, Madam. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, dear Mr. Chair. First of all, I want to thank the Canadian Parliament and government for your commitment to freedom, democracy, and human rights. You know, Canada was always one of the staunchest supporters of the Belarusian democratic movement. And I want to thank you for that, but first of all, for supporting Ukraine, because the fates of Belarus and Ukraine are intertwined. So my name is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. You know, in 2020, I was an ordinary housewife, and I decided to run against dictator Lukashenko, who ruled the country for 30 years. I did it out of love to my husband, who was a blogger, who was imprisoned after his decision to challenge the dictator. By all independent counts, we, Belarusian people, won that election's landslide, but predictably, dictator refused to step down, and he unleashed real terror in Belarus. Thousands of people have been imprisoned, and many more were forced into exile, including myself. So in exile, we continue to fight. We have formed the government in exile, democratic institutions, such as an alternative to the pro-Russian regime in Minsk. And many Western countries recognize us as legitimate representatives of the Belarusian people and call me president-elect. And I'm glad that Canada, since 2020, no matter who is in power, recognizes our movement, and in 2024 launched formal strategic consultations with Belarusian democratic forces. So Belarus is a perfect example of what happens when you neglect democracy. It shows how security and democracy are intertwined. Authorities that don't respect their own people don't respect neighbors as well. The regime in Minsk made Belarus a launch pad for Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Belarus is used for hybrid attacks against Europe. Russia deploys nuclear weapons and strategic missiles to blackmail our neighbors, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland. The dictator is selling our independence to Putin in exchange for his political support. And all of that happens against the will of Belarusian people. Most of Belarusians are against dictatorship. We support Ukraine and lean for European future. But any dissent, any form of resistance is cracked down by the regime. Since 2020, 65,000 people have passed through detention. Every single day, on average, 10 people are being detained on Trump-up charges. People are arrested for everything, for comments, for likes on Instagram, for donations to Belarusian volunteers fighting in Ukraine or helping opposition. As we speak, more than 950 political prisoners remain behind bars, including 120 women. Last year, thanks to US diplomacy and also European pressure, more than 500 people were released. Unfortunately, it didn't stop the repression, and new hostages have been taken since. So Belarus prison remind us about Stalin times. People are regularly beaten, tortured, punished by isolation and cold. They kept incommunicado, and many have died behind bars already. And even those released cannot enjoy fully freedom. They remain under surveillance and restricted in rights. Those abroad face transnational repression. The regime denied them passports, documents, consular services, making them de facto stateless. The regime abuses international mechanisms such as Interpol to chase political opponents. Those who are active in exile, including here in Canada, are blackmailed with their relatives' prosecution in Belarus. So even abroad, our people cannot feel safe. Those who return to Belarus to renew documents, for example, or visit elder parents are often arrested right on the border. So the regime in Belarus wages the war not only against its own people, but against Belarusian culture and identity, our language and our history, same as Russia is doing on occupied territories of Ukraine. So their goal is to make us another Russia and destroy our pro-European aspirations. So today I came here to ask Canada to be a leading voice for freedom and democracy worldwide and put the Belarus situation in focus. And I have some practical suggestions to Canada. So first, keep pressure on the regime, keep sanctions strong, demand the release of all political prisoners and also the full stop of repression. Canada has leverage and you have power. Second, continue and increase assistance for our civil society, for democratic forces, for cultural initiatives, and of course, for independent media. Such programs as Journalists for Human Rights, funded by Canada, help empower our connection with the people on the ground and provide them with truth, not propaganda. Also, Canada can support International Humanitarian Fund to help victims of repression that we launched together with Norway, and 12 other countries already joined. So third, support our accountability efforts. Canada can support the case in the International Criminal Court against Lukashenko's regime for crimes against humanity. We must bring perpetrators to justice, not only for repression, but also for complicity in Russia's war and deportation of Ukrainian children to Belarus. Fourth, help Belarusians in Canada so they can feel safe. We have small but very active communities in Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver. So establish simplified legalization mechanisms and provide them with necessary documents and asylums. Recognize Belarus as an unsafe country to return to and prohibit extradition to Belarus. And fifth, help us to raise the issue of transnational repressions in the UN and OSCE. And I know that global affairs puts a lot of focus on it. And we must prevent dictators from misusing international mechanisms for political prosecution. And the last one, strengthen relationship with Belarusian democratic forces and the United Transitional Cabinet. Because changes in Belarus are inevitable. As history shows, dictatorships collapse when no one expects and must prepare for post-Lukashenko Belarus already now. So when the moment comes, we put the country on the right track. And in the end, I ask you to form the Group for Democratic Belarus in the Canadian Parliament and organize joint events together to highlight Belarus, highlight Ukraine, and our struggle for freedom. Because our fight is not isolated. It's part of a global one for freedom, democracy, for human rights. And of course, change in Belarus is our task, Belarusian people, but no fight for freedom can be won when you're alone. We need allies on our path, and we count on Canada and your leadership.
Thank you. Actually, due to the situation, I give you more than 2 minutes extra. I feel sorry for the other. I have to respect the time, but you got special consideration. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now I would like to invite Madame Monica Leroy to take the floor for 5 minutes. Floor is yours, Madame.
Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. Canada has a genuine and distinguished record in supporting democratic governance abroad. During the Pinochet and Argentine dictatorships, Canadian funding sustained independent researchers.
Excuse me, is it possible a little bit slowly because the interpreter to be able to follow you? Sorry.
Thank you, Chair and members of the subcommittee. Canada has a genuine and distinguished record in supporting democratic governance abroad. During the Pinochet and Argentine dictatorships, Canadian funding sustained independent researchers who later helped to design the democratic institutions that replaced those regimes. Canada led the Commonwealth efforts to impose sanctions against apartheid in South Africa when larger allies resisted. And at the 2001 Summit of the Americas, hosted in Quebec City, Canada anchored the declaration that became the Inter-American Democratic Charter, embedding democratic conditionality into the institutional architecture of an entire hemisphere. The question before this committee is not whether Canada believes in democracy support. It is why we have not built the doctrine, sustained funding, or institutional coherence to do this work systematically. Canadian engagement has been episodic, shaped by program cycles and political winds. That has constrained our credibility and reduced the strategic return on our own interventions. I offer 20 years of practitioner experience at the OAS navigating democratic crises in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Haiti, serving as senior policy advisor to 2 Canadian foreign ministers and field leadership supporting targeted democratic interventions across 5 continents. And today I want to offer 3 propositions. First, democracy support is Canadian national interest. Democratic partners make better trade and security partners. They offer rule of law, contract enforcement, regulatory predictability, the very conditions Canada's trade diversification agenda depends on. Investments in legislative oversight or judicial independence are not charitable acts. These are investments in the durability of the economic and security partnerships our country relies on. The counterfactual also matters. Authoritarian actors are actively undermining the rules-based system Canada depends on, displacing multilateral norms and destabilizing the environments in which Canada trades, invests, and operates. This is not values divorced from interest. It is national interest policy, and it should be treated and structured and funded as such. Second, political institutions are a necessary investment. Civil society support matters, and Canada has capable organizations doing it. But civil society without functional political institutions produces advocacy without governance. In open societies, democracy requires legislatives that work, parties that compete responsibly, and elected officials who can govern. In closed environments, it requires protecting the political and civic space that keeps democratic possibility alive. The numbers are stark. Of Canada's roughly $12.3 billion in official development assistance, about $165 million goes to democratic development. Of that, just $4.75 million reaches legislatures and political parties. When Canadian parliamentarians engage directly with peers through mechanisms like Parliamericas and the Parliamentary Centre, they build institutional trust, political relationships that open doors, and anchor security partnerships. Third, credibility depends on consistency. Canada's multilateral positions, political statements, and global affairs programming must reinforce one another. Belarus illustrates the challenge. Magnitsky sanctions are in place and they matter, but designation without proportionate support for political institutions and without sustained engagement with democratic forces in exile reveals a gap between what Canada says and what it deploys. This subcommittee has heard from the president-elect from Belarus. A legitimate question is whether Canada's material support is proportional to the leadership position it claims to hold. It's time to meet the moment. Global official development assistance dropped by nearly 1/4 in 2025. Democracy and governance programming experienced some of the steepest cuts in decades, with the largest funder, the United States, where roughly 90% of a $3 billion annual budget has been halted. This is a vacuum that will not remain empty. The only question is what and who is going to fill it. My recommendations do not require new money. They require rebalancing and doctrine. First, the committee should ask the government to develop a public Canadian democracy support strategy, one that links Canada's political and multilateral positions to programming and explicitly treats democracy support as an investment in Canadian economic and security interests. Second, direct Canada Global Affairs Canada to fund political actors, legislators, parties, and elected officials with the same intent applied to civil society. Supporting political institutions is not interference. It is the most direct investment Canada can make in democratic durability. And third, recommend predictable, multi-year partnerships with key democratic institutions that carry Canada's credibility into the field. The model here is partnership, not episodic grants. Sustained support allows planning, expertise retention, and the long-term relationships this work requires. Canada has the tools, the credibility, and the strategic interest to play a serious role in supporting democracy abroad. What we have lacked is the doctrine that connects these tools and the consistency that convinces our partners we mean what we say. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Roy. Le temps est bien respecté aussi. Thank you. And
Thank
now
you. You also respected your time.
an answer, but before that, we have to go back to Mr. Leslie Campbell. And I would like to let you know, probably we're going to continue to have the same problem if the problem insists. So we have to say sorry to Mr. Campbell. Mr. Campbell, we'll give you another chance. The floor is yours, please. Mr. Campbell is gone, I believe. We assume Mr. Campbell is no longer with us now, so we would like to go to the next step. It's a question and answer. And I would like to start by inviting Mr. Majumdar to take the floor for 7 minutes, please. Mr. Majumdar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for all of your testimonies today. Really appreciate hearing your perspectives on how democracy and international affairs serve the national interest. It's been very insightful. Svetlana, if I might, it's really good to see you healthy and thriving again. You've been a great friend to Canada, and hopefully Canada has been a good friend to you and your cause. Maybe I could start with you very briefly. A case against Lukashenko has now been brought to the ICC for crimes against humanity, but Canada has not joined. Should Canada support this effort, and what outcomes would you expect from the ICC?
So first of all, I have to say that Lithuania's referral was an important breakthrough. The ICC has now opened an investigation into alleged crimes against humanity linked to Belarus. It's focused on a particular interpretation and prosecution of political opponents. Of course, it's it's not just symbolic case. That means that for us, the doors to justice is open. It is still a long road ahead, but the road exists. It's really we worked on this starting of this case 3 years, so some even lost hope. So what I expect from the ICC, first of all, a serious professional investigation that preserves evidence and identifies those most responsible for the crimes. Second, we wait arrest warrants when the legal threshold is met. And also, third, a message to every official in the Belarusian system that impunity is not forever. I do not expect miracles tomorrow, but for the victims, even this opening of the case really matters. So. I think that Canada, of course, can support the accountability process more effectively. At a minimum, Canada could publicly support this investigation, share the evidence with the prosecutors where possible, fund, for example, documentation work or protect witnesses and survivors on its territory, but also support universal jurisdiction cases. And we call on more countries to join Lithuania's referral, so Canada can join, this case in the frame of International Criminal Court.
Thank you. And just in a minute, if I could ask you, in Poland, I had an opportunity to meet many of your colleagues who are very sophisticated actors in how they represent Belarusian activists and civilians down to the village district. Systemically, what kind of support could be provided to you and your colleagues in these challenging times?
Oh, look, we really people nation without state, and first of all, of course, we need support to our people. While putting pressure on the regime, we asking to support our civil society because it's the backbone of any uprising. So we ask you to provide assistance to Belarusian civil society activists, young initiatives, independent media, and journalism, including human rights reporting. Also, cultural and educational programs are extremely important because regimes trying to erase everything Belarusian. For example, we can propose to increase support for media through Journalists for Human Rights program that is chaired by Markus Kolga. Also, contribution to International Humanitarian Fund is essential because we are expecting more political prisoners to be released, hopefully soon, and all of them need psychological, physical rehabilitation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
No, really appreciate that. That's a good survey of events. And I'm sorry to cut you off. I have just a couple minutes left. Ms. Leroy, it's nice to see you. You have incredible experiences across Asia and the Americas, both on a policy and practitioner level. I wanted to ask you, based on your testimony, you had suggested ways in which doctrine and support could be provided to actors across regions like this, areas of your expertise. What do these areas in Asia and the Americas tell you about Beijing's approach in undermining these democracies around the world?
Thank you. I just returned from spending 2 years in the South Pacific building democracy programs, which was literally designed to confront China's incursion into the South Pacific Sea. They've moved into a region where Western governments were, for the most part, absent, and they have immediately moved in to start building deep sea ports to support their naval blockades if they wanted to move into new territories. They are interfering and building partnerships with security apparatus across the Pacific Islands region. And they're using money to destabilize and corrupt governance institutions and natural resources. Simple partnership programs that work with political parties, that work with governance structures, that work with legislators to build transparency capacity are a very safe and low effort provide an alternative to the Chinese government for partnership with the rest of the world. In Venezuela, I think we've all seen the country, what has just happened in the country over the past year in particular, but that is 10 years, 15 years of erosion by a government that was getting substantial funding from the Chinese government to do erosion of the democratic structures, to eliminate their human rights systems in order to ensure that the Chinese government had access to long-term oil resources. Canada did play a role in supporting International Criminal Court prosecutions or investigations into the situation in Venezuela, but it fell short of taking additional action to support the opposition. Supporting local actors, that's political parties, that is civil society groups, is essential to providing a counterpart for foreign interference that's intent on weakening structures that would support our allies.
Okay, thank you. And Chair, I understand I'm probably at the last 5 seconds of my time, and so I return it to the floor.
Thank you. Now I would like to invite Madame Anita Vanderbilt. Anita, welcome back. We miss you. I hope all is well. You have the floor for 7 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. And it's wonderful to be back, especially with this incredible panel. I think we could spend many hours with these witnesses. And I have a question for each witness. So if we don't get to you in this round, maybe we can follow up. But I'm going to start with you, Mr. DeVoe. You spoke quite a bit about and similarly, some of the previous witnesses about the model that we have, sort of the ODA model of projects, where there's 4 to 5 year funding at a particular country to do a particular project with preset activities and outcomes and outputs, and that model doesn't work when it comes to this urgent global threat of democratic backsliding. You talked about rapid response. You talked about where we could go into risk areas where there's high risk that perhaps arm's length institution or some sort of form of expertise would be able to be better mobilized than projects that can sometimes take months or years to even sign the contract. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that might look like?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, honorable member, for the question. Look, I think, as I was saying in my presentation, I think Canada does have a lot of skills and capacity that I frankly, as someone who's worked practically on every continent, believes are being underused. There are many Canadian experts who've worked for other organizations, including Mr. Campbell's former NDI or UNDP. But we as a country have never really corralled them into using that expertise for ourselves. So, and this isn't to be disrespectful to Global Affairs Canada, but I think there are certain skills and acumen that come with that ability to implement democratic governance projects directly, technical assistance, experts, that isn't found necessarily in Global Affairs Canada. And being able to have a roster of those people that then, through some third-party external organization, whether that's a new one or it becomes a subset of something that already exists. But I really, truly believe that having an external from government allows for more frank analysis and ability to probably ask questions or meet people that perhaps the government wouldn't be able to do. So from that, developing a political economy analysis in a crisis situation, something that I believe that the government of Canada would find very valuable as it decides to make decisions. But I think also our partners would as well. Going back to the Davos speech and Coalition of Middle Powers, it's an opportunity for Canada to be at the table to bring something that actually can provide value that our other partners would want based on the skills that we have. And then taking that and using it as the beginning of a dialogue. So again, instead of trying to impose a cookie cutter approach to our work, thinking about how Canada can help develop a bespoke or tailor-made solution, whether, as again, if that's in Bangladesh in 2024 or God help us that Georgia eventually, becomes a place that's less autocratic. How do we begin to, use our skills to talk about, strategy and approaches that are both politically, informed, but also ones that address all the points that need to be addressed to ensure that democratic standards are being met. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I would note that you and I first met almost 2 decades ago when we were both with UNDP in New York doing this kind of work.
Indeed.
And there's others on this committee who've done similar work. My second question is to Professor Bardal. Gabriella, you've done a lot of work on women, peace, and security, and you did mention GBA Plus and the tremendous backsliding that's happening. Really, the litmus test is what's happening to women's organizations globally. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and the nexus between gender and security, which I know you've done a lot of work on.
OK. Merci beaucoup pour la question. Effectivement,
Thank you very much for the question. Indeed, the situation of women, human rights defenders, and feminist organizations are serious. These are some of the most threatened organizations. We know that almost 70% of women defenders organizations have experienced threats or harassment either online or offline, that 57% identify state actors as the perpetrators of this violence, and that nearly 20% have experienced serious threats or violence, including death threats. So this has a significant impact in that it creates a kind of silence that really masks what's actually happening in some authoritarian states. So they try to use gender issues and identity issues as a way of dividing people. That's happening in Canada and in other countries around the world as well. So there's also the rise of popularism that is hurting the democratic fabric. In terms of this question of women, peace, and security, under the leadership of Jackie O'Neill, the former ambassador, whom I had the honor of working with for a while, Canada set up some very strong models, not only to operationalize the women, peace, and security agenda, but also to build links between the Canadian federal government and civil organization. So this office not only took a whole-of-government approach, by working with many different departments within the government and by supporting international missions and providing political cover for some international actors who were targeted there, but also by establishing very close relationships with Canadian civil society. So, as Mr. DeVoe said, this kind of created a rapid response mechanism to allow us to find solutions in complex problems. So this is experience that can also apply to human rights defenders today.
Mr. Chair, I see that Mr. Campbell is back. Perhaps we could hear his opening remarks.
Yeah, but after finishing the first round. OK. Maintenant, j'invite M. Alexis Brunel-Duceppe de prendre la parole pour...
Now I'll ask Alexis Brunel-Duceppe to take the floor. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for being with us today. Ms. Tikhanovskaya, I was lucky enough to meet you on a couple of occasions, both here in Ottawa and recently in Berlin in February. For us, you are really an exemplar of courage and perseverance, so it's a real honor to have you here with the committee. I was wondering, you know, there have been a lot of questions asked about this. There was the liberation of 250 political prisoners in Belarus following negotiations with Western states. That happened in late March. But, you know, some experts have said that this is a way of legitimizing an authoritarian state. Of course, we want political prisoners to be released, but does that come with, you know, the lowering of sanctions or maybe the legitimizing of the regime? Does that pose any kind of a threat for the international community?
Thank you for your question. But first of all, I have to say that we are grateful to President Trump, Special Envoy John Cole, and everyone who worked so hard to release political prisoners, because every life saved matters. When even one person walks out of jail, it's a victory for the family and, you know, small breath of air for all of us. But let us be honest, if the regime frees some people and then keeps arresting new ones, it's not justice. It's like, you know, like a revolving door. It's like... you know, it's not even, you know, accountability. You know, prisoner releases are good, but they cannot become a substitute for ending repression. We must judge policy not only by how many people are released, but by whether torture stops, where arrest stops, where the new political prisoners stop appearing. Of course, we understand that President Trump's approach, you know, is more transactional. You know, it really might be a success story for President Trump, and we hope that, you know, these humanitarian efforts, you know, will continue. So here we have to to divide humanitarian track and political one. We are in constant communication and consultation with our American partners. They're actually, you know, not doing anything behind the back of Belarusian Democratic Forces, and we really appreciate, you know, this relationship. So, of course, you know, regimes are usually using political prisoners as bargaining chip, and you know, maybe, you know, on one moment, you know, we sometimes need to use this sanction relief to release political prisoners. Also, you know, most American sanctions were imposed because of human rights abuse, and they can be, you know, used to release political prisoners. But for example, if we take European sanctions, they were imposed because of hijacking of airplane, because of threatening our neighbors, because of participation of Lukashenko in this war. So we asking our European partners not to copycat, you know, American approach at the moment, you know, but to leave the sanctions for like bigger game. because we just have formula, American sanctions to release people, European sanctions to release the country, because we need systematic changes to stop repressions and to make Belarus free and independent from Russia's claws and become a reliable partner for Europe. So, it's a long and much heavier road ahead.
Et là, je vais vous poser une question. Vous êtes pas...
And another question, which you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but with everything that's happening in the Middle East, how do you see there's currently the conflict between the U.S. and Iran. How do you see that situation? Do you see it in a negative light or a positive light vis-a-vis your specific relationship? And I mean, if you don't want to answer that, also we can move on to another question.
Look, actually, of course, the world is going crazy now. There are so many conflicts in the world. What is important for me, for my country, is that Belarus remains in focus and Ukraine remain in focus, because the attention of the strongest of this world is dispersed, everywhere, and Belarus might be overlooked in this context. What is important for us is that Lukashenko is sitting at the table of dictators, at the table of losers, and we see how what the fate of dictators. Of course, there might be different methods how to eliminate, dictators, like in the case of Venezuela, for example, or Syria, or now in Iran. But it's also warning to dictators that dictatorship is not forever. That you just have to behave, because you might be the next. And of course, I understand that dictators of the world, they are talking to each other, they are learning from each other, they sharing their tools and instruments, how to suppress, how to intimidate actually the world order. But I believe that democratic world is much stronger. You have much more tools to use. Maybe the problem is that the democratic world doesn't believe in itself enough just to be a strong power against dictatorship. But of course, I think that democracy changes in Belarus is important for democracy worldwide, and that's why we ask our partners, our allies, not to postpone Belarusian topic, not to overlook this in this turbulent world.
Merci beaucoup pour ça, Madame.
Thank you very much. Ms. Leroy, and I'll come back to Mr. Leveau in my next turn, but, I'm sorry, Mr. Brunel-Dissep. I'm sorry you're out of time. You only have 2 seconds. Sorry.
Invite Mr. Leslie Campbell to take the floor for 5 minutes, please. Welcome back, Mr. Campbell.
Thank you. I hope the audio problems are resolved now, but of course, interrupt me if they're not. I think I will go away from my prepared text just because we're already into this discussion debate, and maybe I'll just try to pare it down a little bit to reflect the debate. First of all, just a little context. I come to you from just outside Washington, D.C., where I've been working with the National Democratic Institute, or NDI, for almost 32 years. I left there in the fall. But I'm a Canadian, and from the Canadian political system, from Manitoba, from Ottawa, and brought my experience in Canada to bear internationally. What happened, I was going to talk a bit about the some of the inside things that happened with the DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, canceling most of the democracy programs. But the fundamental issue, the most important issue, is that $3 billion worth of support to democracy abroad and to human rights defenders and to people like Mrs. Tsikhanouskaya are, if not completely gone, radically changed, radically reduced. It was an incredible blow, I think, to a project that has been going since World War II, basically. And it's an even bigger blow, and I think the point that was just made again by our Belarusian colleague, about authoritarian learning, dictators getting together and learning from one another. They're still doing that. And yet democracies have had this sort of blow with these programs that brought many, many organizations, individuals together. Just as an example, NDI, my former organization, worked with more than 300 Canadian politicians, members of parliament, former members of parliament, former politicians over the years to bring their expertise abroad. And that ability is reduced. So just to kind of shorten this and, to defend or to not defend, but to add to what my colleagues are saying, there's never been a better time for Canada to join in a full way, in a very Canadian way, not the obviously network of authoritarians work together, but the network of democracies working together. And I've been talking about this in Canada for many years, and one of the things that has come up a number of times is, yes, that's great, and Canada has a role, we play a role, but there's so many other players, and what would be the niche? What would Canada do where it wasn't duplicating or where it had the biggest effect? Well, much of that concern is now gone. There's not a lot to duplicate anymore. Countries that are working in this field, but again, with the loss of the largest programs funded by the U.S., there's a huge opening. So I'm not going to take any more time except to say that the idea of a rapid response mechanism to respond to unexpected or perhaps untimely changes. Again, we heard that dictators usually fall unexpectedly. Coups happen unexpectedly, sometimes in a democratic direction. Wars have unexpected outcomes. Sometimes they create openings. I'm not defending wars even remotely, but sometimes they create openings. Individuals, and we can think of even the last couple of years, people-led revolutions that have sprung up that we never expected to spring up and to cause change. And of course, a lot of those were put away by force. But I think and I'll end on this, I think it's extremely important for Canada to really get in there with all that it has to offer, which is an amazing amount. And now there's the leadership in Canada that's very interested in this, and provide Canada's particular credibility, expertise, and commitment to these issues, and really, in a sense, double down on what's been done in the past. And the way has been cleared for doing that. So I would encourage much more action. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell. And now I would like to invite Mr. Zuberi to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et les témoins d'être ici aujourd'hui.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here.
For the important testimony. And I'll start off with Madame Leroy. You spoke a bit about the Parliamentary Centre and another organization. How important are these organizations for the promotion of democracy? And we, within our government, Canada, I should say, has supported these institutions. How important are they, the work they've done, and the support into the future for these institutions, would you say?
I think they're as important as Canada decides they want them to be. And they're as important as you, as members of Parliament, decide that you want them to be. The Parliamentary Centre is a non-governmental organization that was created by an act of Parliament that was intended to create greater cooperation and greater programming and partnerships with using Canadian parliamentary expertise globally around the world. If you look at transitional democracies operating in different countries, more often than not, the parliamentary model is the one that is more easily transferable and translated. And that includes members of the staff of Parliament, as well as yourselves, that can participate in whether it's relationship building, whether it's capacity building and training, or sharing expertise from committee structures and oversight and accountability mechanisms. Parlaméricas is a parliamentary association which Canada is a board member of, which its board member consists of all of the countries in the Western Hemisphere. I think it is the only entity that actually has all of the countries of the hemisphere that still includes Cuba as well in that platform. And it is a gathering of MPs coming together to tackle shared challenges.
Right, and we have a lot of associations like the Interparliamentary Union and others, the Commonwealth, et cetera, that we are involved in. I appreciate that response. I'd like to like to, Professor Cohen, I'd like to ask about, I've come across some of your work actually. Je sais que vous avez écrit des...
I know that you have written articles in the newspaper Le Devoir and elsewhere, along with human rights defenders.
Challenging situation in the Middle East, in Gaza, and generally in the region. I know that you have done some work and writings on this. Can you share with us how we can help promote democracy, human rights, and defend human rights defenders?
Mr. President, thank you for the question. It's an important one to think about the role of Canada in active conflicts and how civil society and human rights defenders can be supported. So at the moment, in the conflicts that are taking place, so in the Middle East, but also other conflicts, look at civil societies on the ground and what they need. So there's a dire need for also funding for civil society organizations, working with partners in Canada, but also on the ground. And seeing if I think there's other testimonies that have been mentioned about getting asylum seekers and support for those that would like to also seek refugee in Canada. I don't know if you have...
Yeah, I've been actually to Jerusalem about 7 or 8 years ago. It was a wonderful experience, and I engaged with people from all backgrounds, Jewish Israelis, Palestinian Israelis, and engaged with people in the West Bank. What I noticed in Jerusalem was that I met a lot of people who were involved in dialogue and bridge building and the promotion of respect of everyone regardless of one's background. What I noticed back then, 7 or 8 years ago, was that that sector, those who are doing the difficult work of bridge building, they tend to be they tend to be very much pressurized, and the societies are not really supporting them. Do you have any opinions on how we can encourage that thickening of that space? And I recognize that my witnessing of that was quite a long time ago as compared to where we are today.
I think it's very true that the situation has changed a lot on the ground. I have also visited many years ago. I think the best way now to support is to, again, have this collaboration with organizations that are on the ground and see what they need. In terms of human rights defenders, what is very important is that the situation is dire on the ground, right? Not only in Gaza, but also in Iran. They have to go into clandestinité. They have they are subject to arbitrary detention, torture. So seeing the organizations that are doing the work, what else do they need to support? So funding is one of them, but also if there are Canadian organizations working in those areas of conflict to support those Canadian organizations and the local ones as well.
Merci. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madame Cronis to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start, I'd like to ask Ms. Leroy a couple of questions. We get a lot of people who come to this committee who argue that Canada should be more active abroad. And I'm wondering if you could help us think a little bit about the line between supporting democracy and actually going further than that and inadvertently or advertently in some cases interfering in another country's internal affairs.
Thank you, Chair. I think I highlighted this distinction in my remarks where there's supporting democratic transitions and democratic institutions, and then there's also the alternative to that, which is supporting the creation of civic space. When working with political institutions like political parties, legislatures, in almost every single one of those scenarios, you are working with the government, with the approval of the government, and defining programs in a partnership format, in a partnership setting. when supporting or challenging, we're operating spaces trying to create civic space. Iran would be a great example of that. In the past, one of the activities that Canada did incredibly successfully was facilitating international dialogue between the Iranian people and their diaspora in Canada and in country, supporting internet opportunities for them to have conversations and public forums to talk about how they felt about what was happening in that country. Those are two very different initiatives and approaches because the dynamics were extremely different. It also depends on the values of the country that you're operating in. Whereas I've worked in the Middle East, working on women's political participation programming, where governments welcomed and celebrated that programming coming in as an opportunity. And I've worked in programs in the South Pacific, where there was greater concern about how our work to empower women in a political space and public forums was going to change the community dynamics. And I think to that extent, and much like what Kevin was saying, much like what Les was also saying, is it really is a country-by-country dynamic of having that ability to understand what that line is. And if you're going to cross that line, as one could argue that we have by creating civic space in Iran, doing so intentionally. And this is where creating a doctrine and a strategy that's coherent for our country to engage in this work is helpful.
And that's actually a perfect segue into my next question, which is, are there any safeguards that Canada should be putting into place to make sure that our actions are consistent and transparent and sort of fit into international law and don't stray into the kind of foreign interference that we are struggling with in this country?
My argument for that would be the democratic oversight that this committee itself offers and what it is in your mandate, to seek clarification from the Government of Canada, from Global Affairs Canada, in terms of what activities they are doing and how they're approaching their democratic initiatives and their support abroad. You, as members of Parliament, I think are among the best suited to understand that nuance and where that line exists and operates. And so increasing opportunities for engagement through Canadian-led and Canadian-headquartered organizations like Parlamerica's or Parliamentary Centre, or programs that the President-elect has been citing with Journalists for Human Rights, where there's transparency and public discourse about this, that's going to help clarify what those lines are.
The context of, what I've heard you say is that there are circumstances under which Canada should, in fact, support a movement that might lack majority backing or clear majority backing within its own country. And so do you think that the approval or the decision to do that should happen at the executive level? Do you think it should happen at the legislative level? Is this a question for Parliament? Is it a question for the, for GAC? Where do you think the decision making should lie to ensure that we're careful and thoughtful about it?
I will refer back to my remarks where my comment had said that our programming, our political statements, and our multilateral positioning should be aligned. And it's not a straight answer, but the answer is that in all of these places.
I think I'm
going to come back to the example of Venezuela.
But so, I think what I was asking is I realized that was in your remarks. My question is more of the how. Mm-hmm. We've seen a whole bunch of circumstances. Sometimes things come to Parliament, and sometimes things don't come to Parliament. And so where do you think the locus of decision making should happen? How do you think we can do this in a way so that we are being most thoughtful about it?
Quick answer, please, because time is off. Thank you.
Yeah. The quick answer is to create a doctrine that delineates who is allowed to choose or who is approving what aspects of the programming.
Through Parliament?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I invite Mr. Brunet Duceppe to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. So, Ms. Leroy, Mr. DeVoe talked to us a little bit about the Davos speech. You talked about Beijing and what you saw and experienced in Southeast Asia, notably. Is there not a bit of a contradiction there between what was said at Davos and the fact that just a few years earlier, Mark Carney was shaking Xi Jinping's hand, or rather just before he was doing that, and then he's talking about, middle powers in his speech. When you see this warming that's happening between Canada and China, and, normally the goal of diplomatic relations is to be able to talk through more sensitive questions and issues with the other country. I mean, do you see any contradiction there?
He mentioned both Kevin and I. Maybe I'll jump in quickly first then. We don't live in a world where we only get to interact with and cooperate with our allies and with people that share the same values and systems and structures that we have. Canada will make the economic choices that it has to make in the interests of our domestic population. Would we benefit from working with greater democracies? Absolutely. And we have the opportunity in places where there is greater risk of Chinese interference to undermine the values that we want to share in the interests of our country to build stronger relationships to counter that. The Pacific Islands is a great opportunity and a great region for this example. All of our Five Eye partners, except for Canada, are very actively engaged both diplomatically and also through programs in country, whereas Canada, for the first time, has opened a high commission and a presence in Fiji, one of the 18 Pacific Islands countries, just this past August. Creating opportunities where there's Commonwealth political structures that we can share a lot of processes and structures with and build greater relationships for trade and cooperation is an opportunity to counter the influence of China in that region and create greater opportunities for partnership for countries with Canada with like-minded values.
Monsieur Deveau, peut-être que pourriez...
Mr. Deveau, maybe you could jump into the ring to answer that question as well?
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. Look, I think agreeing with Ms. Leroy, I think that in almost all cases, we're going to want to build, if I can still use the term coalition of the willing, and it hadn't been disparaged 20 years ago during the Iraq War. But I think there are going to be circumstances in which those coalitions might include China, to be brutally frank. Think about the scam centers in Myanmar that have created because of the conflicts that have happened there. Think about Cambodia, where the scam centers are operating. There might be specific, very concrete examples where that coalition might and the implementation of new strategies might involve both ASEAN partners, for example, in those places who are more democratic, like Malaysia or Indonesia or Singapore or the Philippines, but it might also include other partners in those circumstances. So I think we do need to be practical. I think we do need to recognize that it is a multipolar world order. There are other actors who have influence. But at the same time, I think we, to a great extent, are looking for coalitions that involve those that are going to be promoting those democratic standards. I don't think that prevents us from having dialogue, from having discussions. But at the same time, I think, again, as we build up our ability to intervene in an active and proactive manner, we're going to develop a gravitas that's going to allow us to have a lot more opportunity to influence the direction of where those things go versus perhaps actors who are more interested in transactional relationships.
Merci pour ça. Madame Cohen ou Madame Bardal?
Thank you for that. Ms. Cohen or Ms. Bardal, this question is for both or either of you. I think there's an elephant in the room here. We've been talking about funding programs, programs that Canada should support or set up. But if you look at our international development budget, Canada just cut $2.5 billion there. We've also seen what's happened with U.S. aid. There's clearly a trend toward significantly reducing international aid. It's the same thing in Europe and Japan as well. So these budgets are going down. Do you think that that is a serious problem? And if you look at, budgets for defense, they keep going up, and international aid budgets keep going down. Even though I think that, we shouldn't be counting those together and they shouldn't balance each other out. I think we should be, looking at those two envelopes separately.
The second, the next one, please, because almost 1 minute you exceed the time. Sorry. The floor for 5 minutes, please. Anita.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to start by picking up on something that President-elect Tsikhanouskaya said, and also Mr. Campbell, and that is this idea that authoritarians are learning from one another, but democracy practitioners, for want of a better word, are not necessarily, we don't have those networks. And where we did have them, and I'm going to go to Mr. Campbell first, because you were talking about what happened when $3 billion was suddenly cut out of this kind of work. We lost things like the World Movement for Democracy, which was a network of 400 human rights defenders around the world. Those 300 countries that were, or 300 defenders that were being connected. Does this not risk isolating movements like in Belarus? Now we're seeing, of course, hopeful signs in Hungary, Georgia, places like that. Do we not isolate those human rights defenders, those movements, by not having that connecting fiber where those lessons, those experiences can be shared? And how do we create a kind of a system where could Canada be part of creating that kind of model where there is that cross-learning globally across continents by human rights and democracy movements? I'll start with Mr. Campbell, but I do want to save some time for President-elect to talk about how it would impact her on the other side. So go ahead.
Thank you very much, and Mr. Chair. I'll address that very quickly because I want to give as much time as I can. Yeah, I mean, so much has been lost, and actually, I can tie this into a previous question from one of the other members of Parliament on this committee about the kinds of programs that may exist that may not be fully supported by a government in the country, but they're very important nonetheless. And we have someone from Belarus here, but we've also supported in this community of ours dissidents and activists from Tibet, from Myanmar, from Iran, obviously, from Venezuela, as well as Belarus, and I can go on. And I think it's relatively obvious why in some countries you might have, what we often call an offshore program to provide networking and training and support and advice. And it's very important, and it's a lifeline for people who are fighting for their rights and human rights. I can't really overestimate or overemphasize what has been lost in terms of the networking and support around the world. But I think what could happen, to wrap this up very quickly, is that not to reinvent any wheels. In fact, I'm not arguing for that at all, but a rapid response capacity to support, whether it's civil society, an unexpected dictator falling, to support the very, very brave activists that have been, pushing this type of activity for a long time and making small progress. I think having a group of like-minded countries that are willing to pool that, and you can then have the rules of engagement. You can have oversight. You can have very eminent people that we all respect that are part of perhaps like an overseeing board that then pull together these activists, these hundreds, even thousands that have worked in this field for so long that are right now out there. And then, it doesn't have to be all funded by Canada. It can be funded in part by Canada. Maybe Canada plays a convening and a motivating role, a catalytic role. But you get others together that also contribute the funding for something like this. So I'll stop there just in the interest of time.
Ms. Tsikhanouskaya?
Yeah, look, first of all, I just have to confirm my words, how we appreciate Canadian help and assistance and solidarity with the Belarusian Democratic Movement. And of course, we are, as movements, we are in a position to ask, because we people without nation, without state, and we just really support and rely on your support. And just to be frank, small symbolic grants, are appreciated, but they're not enough. We need multi-year support, predictable support, institutional support. Because democratic forces cannot work from month to month like a family, counting coins on kitchen table. We need to know that we will be supported to support other people, to keep Belarus in focus, to fight against really brutal enemy. So of course, we again, we understand that it's our fight, but we need allies on this path, because we are protecting democracy. We are on the front line of this fight, and we shouldn't underestimate the strength of dictators. They see that if there is no unity, if there is no desire to help the nations who are fighting against dictatorship, they perceive it as weakness. And they think about democracy as weakness. And you have to show that, no, we will not leave people who are sacrificing their lives, their freedom. We will not leave them alone. We will support them because they are on the right side of the history. So of course, I really encourage you, to increase or to keep the amount of support to democratic movements worldwide. You cannot help everybody, but just to support those who are sustainable, who are strong, and who are really ready to defend their freedom, independence of their country, and democracy in their country till the end.
Thank you, and we certainly are allies with the incredible work that you're doing, and we applaud and honor the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you.
Mr.
Now I invite Mr. Davis to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank all of the presenters today for the incredible information that you've given us as parliamentarians. It is enlightening, but also troubling, because what I see happening in the world today is the disintegration of support for human rights organizations. We see funding diminishing across the board. But I want to juxtapose that sort of shifting narrative against what we're hearing. We're hearing about a new world order. We're hearing about, trade is now transactional, not based on policies that we have espoused as a nation for many years. And the one that troubles me the most is that we now have to accept the world as it is, not what we would like it to be. I think a recent individual said that out loud. But in trying to defend democracy, Ms. Leroy, what is your opinion on how to sort of mesh those two ideas together? How can we defend human rights when we are engaging in transactional contracts with countries such as China, who have over years had massive civil rights violations and human rights violations, particularly now when we're looking at buying and entering into trade agreements with a country that has demonstrated such outrageous human rights violations? How do we square that circle?
I'm not sure I'm the best person to pronounce on whether Canada should or should not be increasing trade with China. What I would feel comfortable talking about is in countries where we want to increase trade opportunities. I mean, I think this is what Canada's woken up to realize, is that we weren't diversifying early enough, and we haven't built enough partnerships and relationships around the world. And so we're trying to find the fastest solution possible to a very seismic shift that has happened. What we can do is find countries where we can help strengthen their democratic practices and processes, because we do want them to have audit appropriate regulations. We do want to have democratic parliamentary oversight of government finance and spending on infrastructure and contracts. And looking at partners where we do have the ability to influence and help support the development of those systems and of those financial mechanisms, where we can have that, we do have that opportunity to influence that process.
So let's drill down into, say, Taiwan, for example. If China does engage in some activities in Taiwan, in your experience in that region of the world, how would that affect And what are the implications of that globally in the promotion of democracies when we are seeing aggression being increased across the globe? So I just use Taiwan as a potential example, but it is happening elsewhere.
In Vanuatu, China is funding primaries for candidates running for elected office. In other countries in the Pacific, they're funding political parties directly. These are realities that they're of tactics that they're using to interfere in political systems to make sure the outcomes are preferential to them. Our opportunity is to work and create partnerships with groups in that country and democratic structures in that country, that there's an incentive to resist that influence. During the COVID lockdowns in Latin America, there was a lot of concern about China trading COVID vaccines for influence in Latin America. And I'm going to quote the former Secretary General of the Organization of American States who testified before the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And his answer was, you cannot fault a country for reaching for the only lifeboat that's being offered to them. If we want to build greater opportunities and greater space for people with democratic values, we have to help create that opportunity for them instead of expressing frustration with the fact that they haven't chosen a democratic path.
So would you suggest that has been happening for longer than we realized? When you say that we've lost the opportunity to talk about democracy in these countries, in these regions, it seems to me that we dropped the ball a long time ago.
I'm sorry, I will leave the answer for the next round, please, because time is over. Okay. J'invite M. Brunel du CEP de prendre la parole pour 5 minutes.
I'll ask Mr. Brunel du CEP to take the floor. You have 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Just wanted to jump back to that question, or rather the answer that Ms. Leroy just gave. If I'm not wrong, if you look at recent history, there's a former Canadian Prime Minister who managed to topple an entire regime. Mr. Mulroney was the leader who managed to bring down apartheid in South Africa, if I remember correctly. And it had to do with a trade agreement, right? He had convinced Thatcher and Reagan at the time to boycott them, and that is how they managed to bring down the regime. And Minister Anand was at the at another committee recently and said, you know, we need to use trade. But I mean, do you really believe that the Communist Party of China will suddenly discover a passion for democracy because we have a deal on EVs and canola?
I think, can we and should we be doing democratic support programming in China? I think there's a choice that Canada can make to do that. I think there is civic actors who want to create opportunity to improve opportunities for dialogue. There's opportunity to support groups advocating for religious freedoms. But you're talking about a very closed space, and the type of engagement that would happen is a very different scale than the examples that you gave us. Reagan going to China was two very different sized countries at very different moments in history. Canadian engagement in South Africa, again, two very different proportional ability to influence, and the Canada's ability to influence kind of that Commonwealth conversation was also a little bit different. I personally would encourage Canada to take actions and support efforts to increase civic space and to increase democratic dialogue in China. That would be my personal choice. I'm a civil society actor.
Merci. Je voudrais revenir à Mme Cohen, Mme Bardal aussi par rapport à la question que je vous ai...
Thank you. I'd come back to Ms. Cohen and Ms. Bardal with the question that I asked you earlier. You know, you can see that funding for international aid is just melting away. Often that money is used for programs that help defend democracy and help defend the defenders of democracy. There are, you know, legal programs that help people who are in legal fights against authoritarian regimes and so on. So do you see that as a danger that all of this money is being cut by various Western governments? Thank you very much for the question. A decade or so ago, a colleague and friend of mine who was an anti-corruption activist in Burundi left his house and was stabbed to death. At that time, Canada, the US, and many other actors spoke up right away. They called out that crime and took strong action to avoid that type of political violence in the future. Last year, after the cuts to USAID, another colleague was also arrested and dragged out of his house, and there was silence. So that's the difference. I think there's a very intense need in Canada and around the world to have leadership that is based on ethics and morals. We want people to support democracy and human rights. And that can be done with tools that really are not that expensive, right? We talked about a normative framework. We talked about other ideas here today to reach that goal. Having a representative, having a clear Canadian approach that allows us to call out these types of actions. We also heard other suggestions that have less to do with increasing existing budgets and more to do with allocating money differently toward different tools, like a special rapporteur, for example. And we can also do better with the tools that we have now. The parliamentarian organizations, Parliamericas, and so on. We can use our expertise, which we've relied on for a long time. You know, the expertise is there. So we should rely on that. And finally, supporting democracy goes hand in hand with our security interests. If we increase our defense budget and security budget, I think we can also look at that link and see how these two things work together. If I still have a bit of time, Mr. Chair, do I? No, it's run out, sorry. Thank you, Ms. Bardell. I'll ask Mr. Zuberi to take the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair.
Ms. Van den Belt, my colleague. Thank you.
The floor is yours, Anita.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank my colleagues for giving me time on this really important study. And I'd like to just pick up a little bit on some of my colleagues' questions that sound almost like we're putting an oppositional or contradiction between supporting democracy and supporting Canada's economic and security interests. And I don't believe that that is actually the case. I want to go back to Mr. DeVoe, who said something in your opening remarks about the Davos speech. And I almost see that it's a prerequisite if we are to find those economic partners, those security partners, those middle powers, that we are also doing this kind of work to ensure that those middle powers are not falling into the sphere of authoritarianism, so that we have the partners long term that we can then talk about our own economic and security interests. Could you maybe answer and elaborate a little bit on what you meant about the Davos speech in your opening remarks?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, MPA Van den Belt. Look, I think that this is a situation in which we have in Davos, as I said, there are words on a page that were read, but there have to be concrete ways in which we're going to do this. It's now 3 months almost since that speech. And I'm hoping through this committee and through the government, we can begin to look at what that looks like concretely. Some of my colleagues suggested strategy or special representatives, which I think are great ideas. I've mentioned rapid deployment, but I guess all our points to some extent relate to the fact that if there is to be, I would argue it's not a matter of if there needs to be a coalition of middle powers. I think even in the last 3 months, we've seen a deterioration of the American hegemony. And we're now at a position where perhaps the only alternative to us being able to have a rules-based global order is a coalition of middle powers. And Canada needs to be one of the leaders in that. And I think from our experiences, many have mentioned Mulroney during the 80s with apartheid. You could look at the Suez Crisis in the 50s. There were times in which Canada has stepped up, and we do have respect in what we do. This is another time we have to do that. And yes, it's about ensuring that those middle powers that we have a coalition are going to maintain certain standards, or we're going to support them in building, perhaps moving from, quasi-democracy to democracy. But at the same time, it's also about us trying to, I think some wise person once described this as instead, as a strawberry field, where we're going to have in different locations, the popping up of strawberries, but also in this case of solutions. But there's a root at the bottom that's connecting them all. And that root is the values we have, but also Canada's ability to build those relationships and build trusted relationships.
Thank you. And thank you for the strawberry analogy. I think, we were very hub and spoke. I mean, Washington was really the center, and it all linked through Washington. And I think that certainly the Global South needs to have those roots connecting them all. Ms. Leroy, I want to go back to you as well, because you really emphasized in your remarks that it is in Canada's interest to be doing this kind of democracy work. And not everybody sees a connection between, supporting a political party in X country and Canada's national interest. If you could maybe elaborate a bit on that.
The number of questions I've fielded already about the relationship between trade and should we be doing democracy work, I think answers that question. It's better for us to be building economic partnerships and ties with countries who are going to respect the treaties that they sign, that are going to be financially transparent and ethical in terms of cooperation and operation. This means engaging with governments that actually have financial oversight committees, or the capacity within their financial oversight committees to understand how their government budgets are being spent and where that money is actually in fact coming from. This is working with OIG's offices and audit and rule of law structures. This actually creates more conducive opportunities for us to increase trade. It's also with security partnerships, and Venezuela, I think, is a really great example, because I know what's happened in the last few months has been very controversial. But I think in Canada we forget that Venezuela actually is in fact a threat to our peace and security here. Venezuela gangs are using Canadian ports to transfer drugs. They're using Canadian casinos and banks to launder money. The refugee and the immigration crisis of that country has not only, with the proportion of almost a third of a 30 million person population, has destabilized the region, and it is the largest source of migrants moving into the United States. You also have a country in the Western Hemisphere that has created a foothold for Russian military, for Chinese military, and Chinese surveillance technology in our country. They're also a transit point that has linked Hezbollah into the region, into the hemisphere. These pieces, if we are not paying attention to democracy, the consequences are high.
Thank you, Ms. Leroy. And now I would like to invite Ms. Cronus to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks. I had intended a totally different line of questioning, but just based on what Ms. Leroy just said about the degree to which foreign governments are actually sinking their claws into Canada in order to do the things that you've talked about, I'd like to ask you to elaborate on that a little bit, and also to ask you to also elaborate on what we need to do to put a stop to that.
Your question from last time in 2 sentences, and that is, ideally it should be the government of Canada creating a doctrine. Over the past 25 years, and there are members of this committee who have participated in a number of these processes, we've tried to do this 5 times, and we have not yet succeeded in doing so. And until that time that we can come up with that, I would encourage and invite, through the chair, members of this committee to encourage and call on the government to develop this process, because parliamentarians can and should have oversight about the democratic engagement that we have. I can speak to Venezuela because I spent a number of years working on the crisis. And it is open knowledge in Canada through some of our investigation capacities that Venezuelan illicit funds have been in our banking and our casino systems for over a decade. The capacity is there's been a lack of political commitment and ability to respond to that. The Ontario Police and the Toronto Police have publicly acknowledged that the presence of Venezuelan gangs, and there was an announcement, I think it was like about 8 months ago, that there was a group of gang members that were actually turned back at the border. These are issues that do come up quite frequently and sort of get lost in the noise of everything else that is going on. Because if you look at the crisis in Venezuela, you're talking about a situation that I started working on in 2013, that every single year we would be asked, can it get worse? And the answer was, it couldn't possibly get worse. Yet we are looking at 13 years later, and it is functionally a failed state that has required foreign intervention to somewhat stem some semblance of stability.
Well, given that you've been inside of government, I mean, what I've just heard you say is that Parliament should be creating a doctrine, and it should be debated in the House of Commons, that the executive branch of our government then follows in terms of dealing with some of these situations. Whose responsibility is it? Like, how do we, are the questions, is the call to do this to the Prime Minister? Is it to, this is something I stand up in the House on a regular basis. I stood up in the House a few weeks ago and said, the IRGC is in Canada. We have people going missing. We have murders happening on Canadian soil. We have money being laundered through Canadian institutions. The ball is very clearly being dropped, and we get no responses to our questions. And so my question to you is, how do we demand better? What do organizations like yours, who are on the outside watching all of this happen around the world, what do organizations like yours have to say to us in terms of getting stopping the talk and stopping the platitudes and actually getting to work to be able to keep Canadians safe domestically?
Well, so domestically, your point of your counterpart is the Department of Public Safety and the various affiliated entities that report through public safety. Internationally, which is the work that we're talking about today, that would be going through Global Affairs Canada. Those two should be talking to one another. I do believe this committee is also simultaneously having a study on foreign interference that's happening simultaneously to this process. And I believe that someone from the Montreal Institute for Global Security will be, they just published a report specifically on this, and I would defer to the experts that have been focused on foreign interference in Canada to better answer that question.
Thanks very much. Do I have any time left? About a few seconds?
40 seconds, go ahead.
I'm hoping the chair will indulge a bit because, Madam Tsikhanouskaya, it is a privilege to have you here today in this committee, and I just wanted to ask a question of you that's a bit of a personal one, but you're in such a precarious and fascinating place because you're widely seen as the legitimate winner of Belarus's 2020 election, and of course you are leading a government in exile, and that means that you came into leadership under extraordinary circumstances. And I'm wondering if you might just comment briefly on the personal costs in terms of that role.
Madame Kronis, we will have after 3 minutes always. I will give Madame Tsuknaya to answer your question in full.
Thank you.
Okay. J'invite Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe de prendre la parole.
Ask Mr. Brunel-Duceppe to take the floor, please. Yes. Oh, please, I'll let Ms. Tsikhanouskaya answer the question that was just asked previously.
Oh, thank you so much. Look, of course, my life didn't prepare me for such position where you have to take responsibility not only for your family or children, but for the whole nation. But I've really, I'm so proud of Belarusian people. I really enjoy their determinateness. I really see how going through tremendous difficulties in the country, outside the country, going through transnational repressions, having their relatives back in Belarus, they continue, to be active, even knowing that their relatives, their mothers can be detained in Belarus. We really achieved a lot for these 5 years. We managed to build alternative institutions of power. We managed to open case in International Criminal Court. We formalized relationship with the institutions, not being the country. It's so many closed doors for us, but when you believe in what you are doing, when you have, allies in the world, you really believe in your course. So it's difficult. Very often I'm exhausted. It's so difficult for me personally, always ask for solidarity, ask for assistance, ask for support, because, it's like a little bit humiliating position, but you are doing this because you know that people trust in you, that people believe that, you put all your efforts, to help Belarusian people. I really spent so little time with my children, but I hope that they will forgive me because they understand that I'm doing this for them, for their future as well. And I'm sure that Belarus is not the lost case. I'm sure that the changes in many countries, the dictatorial countries, can start with Belarus. Very often I hear, "Oh, nothing will happen in Belarus until something happens in Russia," but I'm sure it's vice versa. Changes in Russia will start from changes in Belarus, because our society is consolidated. Our society has this courage, to continue. And of course, my task is like fighting for Belarus, helping Ukraine as much as we can, not having power, not having like billions and weapons. Also one of our mission is to explain to democratic societies that you have to cherish what you have, and you have to help those who are in need, because it's so easy to lose. This freedom, democracy is invisible. But when you lose it, you feel it. So help those who are fighting for you as well now, because regimes very clearly, feel this undecisiveness of democratic world. They're trying to poison the minds of your population, of your citizens. That why should you care? Why should you care about Ukraine or Belarus? Care about yourself, and it makes your nations like indifferent, to the problems of other people, indifferent to the fight for democracy. So it's not the easy path, but I see how many friends we have around the world, and I see how it's important becoming for other countries to defend the democratic principles and values. And we definitely have all the instruments, and tools to protect the world we are fighting for.
Merci pour ça, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you for that, Chair. And a last question for you. You said that it would be good to have a friendship group, Canada-Belarus friendship group. You are a government in exile. So I'm wondering, what difference would that make for you? Or do you think it would be important to have such a group? Because it seems to me that it should be fairly easy to set up.
Yeah, thank you for paying attention to this, my request. I truly think that groups for democratic Belarus in parliaments all over the world will help us to keep Belarus in focus, because we're really, struggling for attention. Belarus is not so important, just because we don't have gas, oil, and so on and so forth, but it's important for their security. It's important for democracy. And we already have groups for democratic Belarus already in 24 parliaments, and we see that Belarus is on agenda in this parliament more often, because there are people who advocating for our cause. And twice a year we are meeting we have interparliamentary meetings. Last time it was in Rome, in Berlin, in Germany, also in France. Next one will be in London. So the greatest capitals are welcoming our interparliamentary cooperation. So there are so many things I want to brag about Canadian assistance and help and solidarity. So definitely I want to see the member of Canadian Parliament, on this during these meetings, and just being sure that Belarusian question is not overlooked among your parliamentarians.
Merci
you.
infiniment.
Thank
Merci
you.
à tous les témoins pour super
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the witnesses.
On behalf, thank you, Mr. Brunel. On behalf of the subcommittee, I would like to thank all the witnesses taking the time, coming here, expressing opinion, answering questions. Je peux vous dire, j'étais impressionné par cette.
I have to say, I was very impressed by the testimony today. Thank you to everyone. And thank you to all of the witnesses for their testimony on the current situation for human rights defenders and democracy defenders around the world. And around the entire world.
Some other thing to share or to say or to express, please feel free to write to the chair, to me, or to the clerk. Anytime you will get the answer you wish to receive also. And for now, meeting is adjourned, and thank you very much.